Welcome back to part 2 of this presentation. So we've looked at hunger. What about insults and provocations? Well, of course, one of the main insults thrown in this dispute was scab, blackleg, and so on, because not everybody came out on strike. The strike wasn't entirely solid. This is a very remarkable photograph. It doesn't come at all from the coal lockout in 1893. It's not even from England. This is from somewhere in the United States. It's not entirely clear where. It may be from New York, it may be from Atlanta, but it's probably from one of a number of mass transit and tramways strikes in 1915 and 1916. You can see these two girls are on roller skates. I'm not entirely sure of the functions of the roller skates in this context, so let's pass on to the other obvious feature of the photograph, which is that they're wearing sashes. Don't be a scab, say the sashes. Scab is a grave insult. Was it, or an equivalent, used in the coal lockout? Well, certainly strikebreakers and blacklegs were the focus of much anger. Here's a report from very early in the strike from the Leeds Mercury. It's a report from Dewsbury, a coal and woolens town a few miles to the south of Leeds, just a few days into the lockout at the beginning of August, and it reports that a crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 men and lads, besides many women, had gathered around the pits and launched a furious attack on working miners. So we see one of these emotion words again, a furious attack with sticks and stones and pieces of coal on the working miners. In the second week of August, tense scenes were witnessed at the Winnie Moor pit near Wakefield. The colliery company had not wanted to reduce wages and had not locked out their miners, but the miners then decided to give notice of a strike so as to be on an equal footing with the other miners who had come out, as they put it. But the company made difficulties, with the result that the notice was tendered late and miners carried on working until the 10th of August, working out their notices so that they would not be in breach of contract when they eventually went off work. When they did leave work on that day, they found a large crowd of miners waiting for them. Each had a stone in his hand. The Winnie miners were surrounded and interviewed as others cried, "Bah, bah," like sheep bleating, meaning black sheep or blacklegs. Despite this, the Winnie miners were allowed to go on their way and no violence occurred. The following week, however, in the East Moor district of Wakefield, only 5 or 6 miles west of Featherstone, a series of disturbances arising out of relations between the mass of the miners and 5 men, Cornelius Hole and James Pounder, who were non-unionists, and Edward Parkinson and his 2 sons, Sam and George Parkinson, who had been expelled from the local branch of the Yorkshire Miners Association. That's the affiliate of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, a few months before. All 5 men were employed by the company on maintenance work underground while the lockout continued. So they were working whilst others were locked out. On 14th of August, so little more than a fortnight into the lockout, at about 9 p.m, the homes of the 5 men were attacked by a crowd of several hundred men, women and children. All the windows at the front of the Hole's house were smashed. There were 8 children in the house at the time. Mrs. Hole, interviewed by the press, stated, "They have threatened to kill him," meaning her husband, "tonight." Mrs. Pounder retailed a similar story. "They yelled and hooted so loud they could be heard 3 miles away." So did the Parkinsons. Sam Parkinson told the reporter that at the time of the attack, the youngster was in bed and the wife had to go upstairs and fetch her down. Then we had to crouch behind the door while half bricks were hurled at it. The district was said to be in a state of great ferment, with much indignation, another of those anger words, evinced against Cornelius Hole, who at first continued to work despite the threats against him. So one can see here what locked out miners would have called provocations by strikebreakers or blacklegs, leading to angry responses from locked out miners. And we can also see that the strikebreakers in turn were angered by the attacks upon them or the threats of attacks upon them. Why should blacklegging be seen in such an angry light? After all, as some of you may have been aware, the recent strikes by my own union, the University and College Union, has seen a lot of what a 19th century miner would have called scabbing. While strikes have been on, many members of our profession have continued to go to work, to teach, to lecture, to research and administrate, and these people have not suffered the violence or threats of violence that the Holes or the Parkinsons did. So anger is not an inevitable consequence to scabbing. What I would suggest is that in these communities at this time, blacklegging was seen as a betrayal. And betrayal, of course, has a very terrible history in Western culture, as I hope the scene in front of you will remind you. This is a scene from a Fresco Cycle completed about 1305 by Giotto. Known as the Arrest of Christ, it's also known, as I'm sure you can imagine, as the Kiss of Judas. And to fling the accusation of Judas at someone you know, certainly in these communities, was a very heavy insult indeed. So I think part of the reason for the seriousness with which these insults were proffered and taken up is the idea of blacklegging as a betrayal, and the valuation of betrayal as deeply evil, a valuation going all the way back to the New Testament at least. Here's another relevant depiction. This is a painting of a scene from Dante's description of the crossing to the fifth circle of hell, the last station of upper hell. It is the abode of the wrathful and the sullen. Dante writes, "And I made out a swarm of spirits in that bog, savage with anger, naked, slime besmirched. They thumped at one another in that slime with hands and feet, and they butted and they bit as if each would tear the other limb from limb." There's that phrase again. So one sees the association of anger and violence, which I've taken for granted here too. But there are lower circles of hell, and it is the lowest, ninth circle of hell that Dante describes not as the abode of strikebreakers or blackleggers, of course, but as the abode of traitors. One can see a strikebreaker as a traitor to their own community, somebody who is involved in a treasonable act. And we see here that Dante regarded people perpetrating such evils as deserving not just hell, but the very lowest circles of hell. The reason for this has been suggested, I think, most plausibly by an American poet and translator of Dante. Indeed, it's his translation that I've just been reading to you, John Chardy. I hope that's the correct pronunciation of his name. He wrote, "The treacheries of these souls were denials of love, which is God. God is love, and of all human warmth. As they denied God's love, so are they furthest removed from the light and warmth of his Son. As they denied all human ties, so are they bound only by the unyielding ice." Ice, because this is what is found in the lowest circles of hell, according to Dante. Not the hottest fires you might expect, but a scene of ice and cold. Let me return now to a narrative of provocation. I've been talking about provocation by strikebreakers and those who oppose them, but there are also provocations by colliery managers, not by scabs or strikebreakers. I'm sure many of you will recognise the scene on the slide in front of you. If you don't, I shan't tell you. At least one miner in Featherstone seemed familiar with the gesture. That's in the written record. So let me return to a narrative focused on the Featherstone massacre. If we go back to a couple of days before the massacre, to Tuesday the 5th of September, surface workers were still at work at Featherstone. They were loading smudge into railway trucks, and some of it was being sold. The rest of it may have been used in the colliery's own boilers. A marching gang of men, women and lads armed with sticks and cudgels told the surface workers, "If you don't give over, we'll knock your bloody ribs in." And the men stopped working and ran off. So, smudge, what is it? It's dust, coal dust. It's coal which is of an even smaller size than slack, and slack is often coal which found a difficult sale. Nobody wanted it because it doesn't give out much heat, and it's extremely difficult to light. Its main use, in fact, was in damping down a fire at night. Damping it down carefully could keep the fire going throughout the night without consuming a great deal of coal, without therefore being very costly, and meaning that one wouldn't have to relight the fire first thing in the morning. That was really its only use. So here we have an advertisement from Abraham Madge, coal merchants of Camberwell in London in 1891. He's advertising for sale various sorts of domestic coal, usually distinguished by provenance: Wallsend in the northeast, Silkstone from Yorkshire, and size: large, nuts and cobbles. Below those grades were the cheapest grades, slack and smudge, and he attempts to persuade potential buyers that cheap coals are the dearest: no heat, all dust and waste. So he implies, buy my more expensive coals. So that's what smudge is. During the lockout, coal was so scarce that slack and smudge even could find a market. If you look at the Yorkshire Post and Leeds Intelligencer for the end of August 1893, so after the lockout had been going for almost a month, you'll see here an advert for screened house coal. That is to say, house coal that survived passage across a screen, a large sieve, because it was in large lumps. Unscreened coal, that is to say, coal in all sorts of sizes, and slack and smudge. So we can see that during the lockout, smudge became saleable. This is the background to the arguments that took place before the massacre at Acton Hall Colliery in Featherstone. On Wednesday, the 6th of September, the day before the massacre, Acton Hall miners met with the manager, a chap called AJ Holliday, and they said the loading of coal for sale was generating a very strong feeling among the miners, and it would be difficult to restrain the violent proceedings. One gets the impression this is all said in a very calm way, but it's relating statements about feelings, and it's suggesting that those feelings could lead to violence. This is actually rational argument, is giving Holliday a reason to stop loading the coal for sale. And indeed, Holliday seems to be persuaded, and at the end of the interview promises to stop loading the smudge. He promises to stop loading the smudge for sale. Later on that day, however, surface workers at the colliery are surrounded by a crowd armed with sticks, men and boys and women and all, who insist they cease work. They use very strong language to the surface foreman, a man called William Jakes. If you went near the smudge again, they would tear him from limb to limb. So this is a threat which I've used in the subtitle of the paper as a whole. The threat was actually carried out. Jakes and his wife were assaulted in their homes in Featherstone later that night, although they were not, of course, literally torn from limb to limb. Now we come to Thursday, the day of the massacre itself. Earlier in the day, a group of women entered the yard and insisted that all work should stop, not just the loading of smudge, but all work, and they were joined by a group of youths armed with sticks and stones. This is England, so there are no firearms, just sticks and stones. The group told Holliday he had broken their agreement. They pointed towards 2 wagons of smudge, which were ticketed to Bradford. Holliday responded, "The tickets are old ones. I've kept my promise." Again, here is rational argument. Here is a consideration, Holliday is saying, that might persuade you to change your mind. The tickets are old. The tickets are not new, but it remains true that I have kept my promise. The crowd didn't believe him. Rational argument doesn't always win. They overturned the coal wagons, windows were broken, and Holliday went to fetch the police. He had to go to Wakefield to fetch the police because there was only one police sergeant resident in Featherstone itself. So he went to police headquarters in Wakefield. There he found that there were no police to be had, only soldiers. A fateful discovery indeed. So let me just pause for a moment here and take an interlude to think about the relationship between lies and humiliation and anger. The crowd thought that Holiday was lying. The crowd thought that Holiday, despite his promise, was loading smudge for sale in Bradford. When one is lied to, and one knows this, or thinks one knows this, then one may feel humiliated. You do not lie to somebody you respect. It is a mark of respect that you tell the truth to them. So to be lied to, if one knows this, is to be humiliated. We can see this perhaps more easily in a fictional example. I know I said I wasn't going to look at fiction, but hey, this is Dickens. This is a scene, in fact, taken from our mutual friend, and it shows Mr. and Mrs. Lamley, a couple of characters from that novel. They've each married the other under the impression that the other is rich. They have just discovered that each is, in fact, poor. Both are humiliated by the other's deception. She is angry, writes Dickens. He is livid. Another emotion word for an angry emotion. So we see here that lies can easily lead to feelings of humiliation. Humiliation, we can see, can lead to anger. Dickens certainly thought so, and I'll suggest that he's not alone a little bit later. So let's go back to the narrative. Eventually, soldiers arrive at Acton Hall. To be specific, they are 28 infantrymen under the command of Captain Digby Barker. They arrive at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and enter the colliery yard. They are jeered and hooted by the crowds who've remained there. Barker finds there's no JP, no magistrate present, and he feels without a JP, the person who has to read the Riot Act, if the Riot Act is to be read, without a JP present, he can do nothing. So all he can do is to protect his men from the antagonism of the crowd. Remember that sticks and stones are readily to be found, and so he, with his 28 men, hides in the colliery engine house. He doesn't stand in the open air, he actually hides. This again suggests some humiliation here. This is a theme I haven't developed, but I think it's worthy of development. It's the feelings of the soldiers, not the miners, not even the coal owners, but the feelings of the soldiers themselves. Barker and his men stay there for some hours. By 6:30, Holiday has returned to the colliery. He's asked to remove the soldiers, and he refuses this. He says, "I have no power to remove them." A crowd of thousands gathers. Holiday is again asked to remove the soldiers, and again he does not. Shortly after this, another crowd arrives. It's thought from a neighbouring colliery village called Snydale, led by a miner called Amos White. And this crowd appears to be somewhat more aggressive than the previous crowds who've been present in the colliery yard from time to time throughout the week. Again, Holiday is asked to remove the soldiers, but the soldiers stay put. As I say, this crowd seems to be more aggressive, and several shout, "Kill him!" meaning Holiday. "Kill the bugger while you have him!" It's one of the great things about some of the sources available for this incident, this event, that we do indeed find bugger written down in full, and we don't have to cope with the rather prissy B dash 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 that appears in the report of the Committee of Inquiry, for instance. So this is where we've ended up in this dispute. Remember, we started with amicable understandings, and now we've got to a point where several miners are shouting in reference to a colliery manager, "Kill him, kill the bugger while you have him." Around about 7 o'clock, the colliery yard was set alight. Captain Barker was approached in the engine house by 6 men, 6 miners, and they say to him, "Leave, or we shall burn you out." Again, this is rational speech. It is giving Captain Barker a reason why he should do something. It is attempting to persuade him to leave. Barker eventually says, "I'll go if the crowd goes." So he attempts to negotiate. He is indeed persuaded. He attempts to bargain with the 6 men who've approached him in the engine house, and the 6 men accept the deal. Barker goes with his men to the railway station adjacent to the colliery yard. They'd arrive by train and would expect to leave by train. But the crowds don't keep their side of the bargain. The crowds remain. So again, one can imagine that Barker will have been feeling more than a bit humiliated. Finally, about 8 o'clock, Bernard Hartley JP arrives from Pontefract. Pontefract is only a couple of miles away from Featherstone, but it takes them until 8 o'clock to arrive, by which time, remember this is September, and British summertime was not introduced until 1916. Darkness has fallen. The troops are marched back from the station to the colliery yard, and the crowd told to disperse. It does not, and so at about 20 to 9, Bernard Hartley reads the Riot Act. The crowd stays put. About 9:15, in other words, after less than the hour specified in the Riot Act, about 9:15, Hartley orders the troops to fire. Firstly, in as limited a fashion as possible. Only 2 soldiers fire. But then, after this has no effect, a second time by 8 soldiers. In this volley, Duggan is mortally wounded and Gibbs is killed. The crowd still remains. Okay, so let's reflect on this narrative for a few moments. It's been a narrative of insults and provocations, and it would appear from the request made repeatedly by the miners that the presence of police and soldiers was regarded in and of itself as provocative. The police presence was heavy by the standards of the day, although nothing like as heavy as we saw during the 1984-85 miners' strike. It is evidenced by photographs like this one, which is of Glasshoughton Colliery. It's dated September 1893 and is probably after, rather than before, the Featherstone massacre. Glasshoughton is just south of Castleford, so it's a couple of miles north of Featherstone, that is to say, within an easy walking distance of Featherstone. Looking at this photo, I would suggest that the police could rather easily be taken as an army of occupation, and they are clearly on the side of the owners, which will have reinforced any such impression. Certainly not on the side of the miners, despite the fact that it is the owners' actions in attempting to force down wages which has brought the threat of disorder to the area. I think this is part of the key to understanding these events. When people saw police and soldiers en masse occupying towns and villages, some at least seem to have regarded it as an irritation to a free people. Here's a picture from an early film about Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, the events that began the 1905 revolution in Russia. I think it was events akin to this that were in people's minds when they saw police and soldiers massing in the context of disputes such as the coal lockout of 1893. 1905 is obviously after 1893, but Russia had been a byword in Britain for tyranny for a long time before 1905, and one of the ways in which that tyranny was expressed, experienced and recognised was by the use of police and soldiers in a repressive, tyrannical and violent fashion. So there was a sensitivity to the deployment of police in numbers and troops in whatever numbers. When police and troops came to scenes of unrest, it made people, at least some people, ask, are they not citizens of a free country? Are we not a free people in England? Or are we under the yoke of tyranny, such as is the case in Russia? So I think this is what's going on here, and this is why there was such a repeated request of Holiday and then finally of Captain Barker himself to remove his troops. That perception was shared by the local left-wing press. The Yorkshire Factory Times wrote, "The military have gone from Dewsbury. It was a mistake for them to be there at all, as it was, and all this next is in capital letters, an insult of the deepest character." Similarly, it wrote in another report, the mounted police were hanging around the Co-op Hall while the miners' meeting was going on. The presence of a mounted police force was an insult to the peaceable inhabitants. It suggested that the peaceful inhabitants of Featherstone and the other colliery areas of Yorkshire and Lancashire were not a free people, but that they were slaves of a tyranny. So let me return briefly to the narrative. What happens afterwards? Well, what happened afterwards was, in some ways, not much. After the drama of the massacre, the activities of the marching bands were checked by the shock of the shootings, but the lockout continued and hunger deepened. Eventually, but only in mid-November, a conference was convened by the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, and chaired by the Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Rosebery. Here's a picture of the conference. It was an event of a single day, and Rosebery is there standing to read out the terms of settlement to the assembled miners' representatives on the left and the coal owners' representatives on the right. Sam Wood wrote, towards the end of this eventful day, it's the 17th of November, men and women gathered in groups about the villages and towns, talking and waiting for the news. Presently, there was a great stir on every hand. The telegraph had flashed its welcome message throughout the country. Peace with honour. The men to restart work at once at the old rate of wages. There was boundless enthusiasm in every colliery district. The victory of Waterloo was nothing to this, and the thousands who had suffered so long and so severely were almost beside themselves with joy. So I've been talking almost all the time about anger, but we can see at the end of the dispute different emotions entirely, and I'll return to those briefly in a moment. But you might well be saying, what about the women who've been mentioned in many of the reports that I put in front of you? You may have been surprised to notice that the crowds were reported to be composed not only of men, or even men and boys, or even men and youths, but men, women and children. So what about the women? Did they feel things the same way as the men did, or did they feel things differently? Women in the lockout appear almost entirely as miners' wives. Women have been banned from working underground in coal mines since 1842. A few still worked on the surface, but mainly in Lancashire. In Yorkshire, around Featherstone, there would have been none at all. Women were present in action, as I've indicated at many points in this presentation, but women are rarely given voices in reported speech by the newspapers of the time. No woman, not one, was called as a witness to the Bowen Inquiry Commission. Nevertheless, women appear to have been united with men in feeling, though women expressed their feelings somewhat differently. Women were allowed, for instance, to shed tears. Men, by this point, were not. Big boys don't cry. But this was a relatively recent development. If one goes to newspaper reports of Nelson's funeral in 1805, for instance, one can see statements indicating that the sailors, who were clearly no wimps, who attended that funeral, shed tears quite freely and were not criticised for doing so. So the male reserve in the expression of distress was relatively new in 1893, and yet it is clearly observed by this point. The Sheffield and Rotherham Independent reported on the 1st of August that the miners had been splendidly supported by their wives. Labour leaders declare that women are the best trade unionists, and it is undoubtedly a fact that the remarkable unity and determination that exists in the ranks of the Miners' Federation is largely due to female influence. So this suggests that there was indeed a unity in feeling between women and men, at least at the start of the strike. Here is a letter published in the Wigan Observer and District Advertiser for the 27th of October, so getting on towards the end of the strike, quite late on in the dispute. The writer has not given her name, and there is always a question in any case about whether published letters to the press are genuine. But bearing that in mind, and for what it's worth, let's look at it. It's from a purported miner's wife, and she writes, "I see that the master blaming the miners' wives for the miners not returning to work." And she goes on to say, well, they're quite right, actually, you know. And she goes on to state that the masters are answerable for the piercing cry of hungry children and the rash acts of those men who have done wrong, by blacklegging, I think she means, under the pressure of privation, misery and wretchedness. So there seems to be little division between men and women in this dispute. The rejoicings that Sam Wood described at the end of the dispute in November were reported in an interesting way for this question. An instance is given by the Yorkshire Evening Post in its issue for the day after the end of the dispute had become known. It's difficult to read the text on the screen, so I'll read it for you. The end of the strike has been signalised by rejoicings in all the affected districts. Some of the reports showing the joy of the women and children are indeed pathetic. That is, they excite pity in the observer. The news of the settlement was received at Castleford with wild excitement. Men, women and children danced for joy at Alfreton. The men threw their caps in the air and cheered until they were hoarse. In some places the church bells were rung during the evening, and in most places of worship in Derbyshire, Thanksgiving services will be held today. When it became known in Bolton and the surrounding districts that the strike had been settled, there was general rejoicing. The miners and their wives manifested their satisfaction by dancing and singing in the streets, whilst the same spirit of hilarity characterised the gatherings of the soup kitchens. Describing the reception of the news at Barnsley, a correspondent says, "It was the women that were the first to recover themselves. The silence was broken by the exclamation which broke from a wan, tidy-looking woman with the inevitable shawl pinned over her head. But that's blessed news." And then might be heard on all sides expressions of joy. Hands were shaking, tears rolled down the women's faces, and it was altogether a scene which is to be impressed on one's memory as long as he or she lives. So we see here that the expression of emotion is different. Tears roll down the women's faces, but by implication not the men's. And women are put with children in some descriptions I've read out to you. Some of the reports showing the joy of the women and children are indeed pathetic, but not the reports of the joy shown by the men. So there is a difference in the way in which women and men react, or if you'd like, are allowed to react to joyful news. But in the course of the lockout itself, we see little division emotionally between men and women. Let me summarise. Let me try and draw some of the morals of the story. That's why I've given you a picture of Aesop to look at here. He being the man whose fables always drew a moral at the end. I shall try and follow his example. First of all, why did the conflict turn violent? Well, I've suggested it was because people, both women and men, became angry. Why did they become angry? Partly because of the bodily distress, the hunger. Although it has to be said that the hunger was widespread, but the violence was sporadic and scattered. There was violence at Featherstone and at some other collieries, but other collieries, including some at Featherstone itself, were entirely peaceful. So the hunger is not a sufficient explanation. In Featherstone at Acton Hall Colliery, we saw managerial lies, or what were thought to be lies, and I suggested that such lies would have been experienced as humiliating. And we know, or we think we know, that humiliation can lead to anger. We also saw that the presence of police and soldiers was regarded as provocative by the miners, provocative of anger. But also again, there's an element of humiliation in this, as there was in the hunger as well. People were forced to beg, people were forced to accept charity. Both these things would have occasioned feelings of humiliation. The psychologist Thomas J. Sheff has suggested that humiliations are provocative of anger. Indeed, he argues that the reason why people become angry from time to time is largely because they have been humiliated or they have felt humiliated. We've seen that the actions of strikebreakers may have been seen as betrayals, as treason, not as reasonable actions to be taken in the circumstances, possibly excusable by the youth of one's family or other personal circumstances, but as a denial of love and productive again of anger and hatred. So it seems possible to give explanations of why the conflict turned violent, and those explanations are multifaceted, as indeed we would expect them to be, I think. This is Thomas Sheff's main book. It's called Bloody Revenge, Emotions, Nationalism and War, and is very ambitious. Indeed, he attempts to explain the outbreak of World War I in terms of the emotions, and specifically the emotions of humiliation and anger. That's not as unsuccessful an attempt as you might imagine. It's a bit more persuasive than I certainly expected it to be on beginning the book. What about reason? What happened to reason? Well, I think we can see here that reason remained. We see anger and violence in close conjunction with requests, negotiations, threats, and indeed violence. We see repeated requests to remove the soldiers and the negotiations or attempted negotiations with Holiday to bring about this end. We see a parley with Captain Barker where he is given a reason, not a very pleasant reason, but a reason to remove his soldiers. We see threats to service workers which give them reasons to stop working. We see threats and violence specifically to William Jakes and his wife. So we see requests, negotiations, parleys and threats, all of these using reason in an emotionally highly charged situation. We see, I think, that reason and emotion are compatible, and we remember that after all, the lockout was settled by negotiation, by a bunch of men sitting around a table in the Foreign Office, chaired by the tactful and diplomatic Foreign Secretary, Lord Rosebery. Women and men, I suggested, were united with men in feeling here, but we've also seen that outside observers saw women as comparable to children in certain circumstances, and we've seen that women have been perhaps more ready to express emotions in particular ways, whether they be by tears or by dancing in the streets. So finally, some conclusions. I would argue that anger is not always incompatible with the use of reason and the pursuit of peaceful negotiation. I will put it no stronger than this. After all, this is just a case study. There can be restraint in angry human affairs, I would suggest. Let me just offer a coda and try and bring this presentation right up to date. Let me just refer you to my favourite Labour MP, Jess Phillips. She is pictured here telling the Prime Minister, this is back in 2019, so it's Theresa May, that she will not sit and listen to the Prime Minister crow about employment going up, when where I live, employment is falling and hunger is rising. She said she's enraged with the PM's complete and utter lack of bravery on Brexit. That's all from The Guardian. I suggest that going back to that rather more nuanced understanding of anger that was perhaps a bit more prevalent in the 19th century than now, that Jess Phillips is angry, but not in fact enraged. She is rational. She gives a reason. She talks about employment falling and hunger rising in contradistinction to what the Prime Minister has asserted. So despite her anger, she has given a reason. She's angry, but she's rational as well. So I think this presentation has a resonance in the events of the present day. Thank you.